A royal guard walked straight through the front gates of Britain's most secure prison, wearing full ceremonial uniform. The officers there told him to turn around, but he didn't speak, just handed over a sealed MOD file marked Eyes Only and said 5 words. He saved my life once. They tried to stop him, tried to radio command, but the guard was already past the threshold, walking into a place no one in uniform dares to enter without clearance. What they didn't know was that the man locked inside hadn't had a trial in 7 years, and that the guard wasn't here for ceremony. He was here to bring someone home. Before we show you what was buried in that file, make sure you're subscribed and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. You won't believe what happened next. You know that particular kind of London morning where the rain's stopped but everything's still wet, and there's this heavy grey hanging over the city like unfinished business? That's exactly what it was like at 07:42 a.m. when the most unusual visitor in Belmarsh's history came walking through those forbidding gates. Not in a van, not with lawyers, not even with an appointment. Just a man in a uniform that had no business being anywhere near a place like this. Officer Tarrant was manning the front desk, probably thinking about his second cup of tea and whether Arsenal had any chance this weekend, when the electronic doors slid open and this figure stepped through. Tall, shoulders squared, boots clicking against the polished tile with that particular rhythm you only get from years of parade drill. Tarrant looked up from his paperwork, blinked twice, then did what any sensible person would do when confronted with the impossible. He reached for his radio. "Sir, I'm going to need you to stop right there," he called out, palm raised like a traffic warden. "This is a secure facility. Are you lost?" The man didn't break stride, didn't even acknowledge the question, just reached into his overcoat with practiced ease and produced a folded document, the kind that looks important because it's been folded and unfolded too many times, edges worn soft from handling. He placed it on the desk without a word. Tarrant picked it up, squinting at the official letterhead. Ministry of Defence. Some kind of clearance form with stamps he'd never seen before. But it was the handwritten note at the bottom that made him pause, scrawled in fading black ink, like someone had written it years ago. He saved my life once. Behind the reinforced glass partition, another officer hit the silent alarm. Standard protocol. But even as the red light blinked and radios started crackling, something in the air suggested this wasn't your typical security breach. This felt different. "What's your business here?" Tarrant asked, trying to sound official while his brain was still processing what he was seeing. The man spoke for the first time, voice quiet, controlled, like he was used to being heard without having to shout. "He saved my life once." Then he started walking again. "Oi! You can't just... Sir, stop!" But Lance Sergeant Callum Briggs, though Tarrant didn't know his name yet, kept moving, through the checkpoint, past the metal detectors, into the maze of corridors that led to the heart of Britain's highest security prison. Behind him, chaos was starting to brew. Radios buzzed. Senior staff got pulled from their morning briefings. Someone was trying to figure out who'd authorised this, how it had happened, and what the hell they were supposed to do about it. But Briggs? He walked like he belonged there. Like those grey walls and the smell of disinfectant and the distant sound of clanging doors were just another posting, another duty station. He'd been to worse places. What none of them knew, what none of them could have guessed from looking at that pristine uniform, was that Callum Briggs had spent the last 6 months fighting his way through layers of bureaucracy thick enough to choke on, filing requests that got lost, making phone calls that went unreturned, following paper trails that led to dead ends and locked doors. It had started with a Freedom of Information request that came back so heavily redacted it looked like abstract art. Then came the meetings with the military lawyers who spoke in careful euphemisms about sensitive operations and national security implications. One particularly memorable conversation with a Defence Ministry official ended with Briggs being told, politely but firmly, that pursuing this matter further could be detrimental to his career prospects. That's when he knew he was on the right track. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source, a retired clerk from the MOD archives who remembered processing unusual detention orders in the years following the Syrian deployments. She couldn't officially help, she explained over tea in a cafe near Westminster, but she could mention that certain classified files sometimes got misfiled in publicly accessible sections during database transfers. 3 weeks later, Briggs found exactly what she'd been unable to tell him about, all because he couldn't forget a debt. 7 years ago, in a place called Helmond Province, Sergeant Rhys Nolan had dragged Briggs out of a burning convoy under sniper fire. But that was just the beginning of it. The IED had flipped their Mastiff completely, trapping Briggs under twisted metal with shrapnel in his leg and smoke filling his lungs. Standard protocol would have been to call for backup, wait for support, establish a perimeter. Nolan had about 30 seconds before the fuel tank went up, and he made a choice that saved 3 lives and probably should have cost him his own. He went back into that wreckage twice. First for Briggs, then for their interpreter, a kid named Ahmed, who had 2 daughters back in Kabul and spoke better English than half their unit. By the time Nolan dragged the last man clear, enemy fire was so thick you couldn't see the horizon through the muzzle flashes. But he wasn't done. With Briggs barely conscious and Ahmed bleeding from a head wound, Nolan carried them both 3 kilometers through hostile territory to an extraction point that existed only on outdated maps. He talked to Briggs the entire way, stupid jokes, stories about his sister's terrible cooking, anything to keep him conscious and fighting. When the helicopter finally found them, Nolan refused to board until both men were loaded and secure. That's the kind of soldier he was, the kind who counted everyone else before himself. 2 days later, Nolan filed an after-action report that told the truth about what happened out there. About civilian casualties, about friendly fire, about orders that came down from above that didn't match what they saw on the ground. Within a week, he'd vanished. Not transferred, not reassigned, just gone, like he'd never existed at all. His mates were told he'd suffered a psychological break, that he'd tried to leak classified information to the press, that he was a security risk who'd been dealt with appropriately. But Briggs knew better, because he'd been there. He'd seen what Nolan saw, and he knew that good soldiers don't just crack. They get cracked by people who can't handle the truth. So when he finally tracked down where they'd buried Rhys Nolan, in a cell deep in Belmarsh's military wing, with no trial date and no release date, and no one asking questions, well, Briggs decided it was time to collect on an old debt. He reached the final checkpoint, where a nervous young guard was clearly wondering if he should be stopping this madness or just letting it play out. The kid chose wisely. The door buzzed open. Block H solitary confinement. The place where they put people the system wanted to forget. Briggs walked down a corridor that felt more like a tomb than a hallway. Fluorescent lights humming overhead. Everything painted in that particular shade of institutional green that somehow manages to drain hope from the air itself. At the very end, behind a door marked only with a number, sat a man who'd been erased from every official record but one, the memory of someone who refused to forget. The lock clicked. The door swung open. Rhys Nolan sat on the edge of his narrow cot, head down, hands clasped loosely between his knees. He didn't look up at first. Visitors weren't something that happened in his world anymore. 7 years of that world. 7 years of walls the colour of old bones and silence so thick you could taste it. 7 years of wondering if anyone on the outside even remembered his name. Then he heard a voice he thought he'd never hear again. "Thought I owed you a visit." Nolan's head came up slowly, like a man surfacing from deep water. His eyes, still sharp despite everything, found Briggs standing in the doorway, and for a moment neither of them moved. "You're late," Nolan said finally, and there was something in his voice that might have been humour, if humour was something this place still allowed. Briggs stepped inside, moved to the far wall, and did something no visitor to Belmarsh had probably ever done before. He sat down on the floor, cross-legged, like they were back in some forward operating base, sharing rations and watching the horizon for trouble. "Wasn't sure anyone would still be here," he replied. "Where else would I go?" Nolan asked, and the question hung in the air like smoke. They sat in silence for a moment. Not the uncomfortable kind. Kind that comes between people who've been through something together, who've shared weight that civilians couldn't understand. "They told us you went dark," Briggs said eventually. "Said you'd had a breakdown. Tried to sell secrets to journalists." Nolan's laugh was dry as dust. "And you believed them?" "For about 5 minutes." Briggs shifted slightly. the red wool of his tunic catching what little light filtered through the cell's single window. Then I remembered who pulled me out of that canyon. Nolan looked away. You were unconscious. Didn't give me much choice. You fought half the ridge to get me to that extraction point, Briggs continued, his voice steady but carrying an undercurrent of something deeper. Then you handed in your report and everything went sideways. They wanted me to edit it. Nolan's hands tightened slightly where they rested on his knees. Leave out the bodies. Say the orders came from command. Pretend the drone strike was our call instead of some desk warrior's mistake. And you said no. I said no. The words came out flat, final. Told them I wouldn't sign my name to a lie, not even a classified one. That was it. That was the moment that had cost him 7 years of his life. One decision, one moment of refusing to bend. Next morning, 2 blokes in civilian clothes showed up at my quarters, Nolan continued, his voice taking on that peculiar tone people use when recounting something that still doesn't quite feel real. Said it was temporary reassignment, blindfolded me, put me in a van, haven't seen sunlight since except through that window. Briggs looked around the cell. Bare concrete walls, a sink that had seen better decades, a cot that probably qualified as furniture only by the loosest definition. No books, no photos, no personal effects of any kind. Why didn't you break? He asked quietly. Nolan was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was softer. Because someone like you might remember. The words sat there between them, heavy with meaning. Eventually, Briggs stood up, straightened his jacket with the automatic precision of someone who'd been in uniform so long it was basically a second skin. He reached into his coat and pulled out an envelope. Official-looking, crisp edges, the kind of paperwork that either saves your life or ends it. Then let's make sure they remember properly, he said, and handed it over. Nolan took it, with hands that weren't quite steady. 7 years of handling nothing more official than meal trays and laundry tickets, and suddenly he was holding what looked like his entire future between his fingers. The letterhead said, Ministry of Defence. The content made his breath catch. It wasn't just about him. It was about Colonel Martin Stroud, the man who'd ordered Nolan to falsify his report, who'd signed the detention order that buried him in this place, who'd made him disappear like he'd never existed at all. Stroud had been caught. Finally. Dishonourably discharged for what the document clinically described as unauthorised detention operations. But the real kicker was the list underneath. Other names. Other soldiers who'd found themselves on the wrong side of Stroud's version of justice. Some had been quietly released. Others had been transferred to psychiatric facilities. At least one had died in custody, officially by suicide. Though the circumstances raised questions no one seemed interested in asking. You weren't the only one, Briggs said quietly, watching Nolan absorb the information. Just the only one left. Nolan read through it twice, 3 times, like he was afraid the words might change if he blinked. When he finally looked up, his eyes held something they hadn't in years. Not hope exactly, but the possibility of it. How long have you been working on this? Briggs didn't answer directly. Didn't need to. The evidence was in his uniform, in the fact that he was standing here at all. This hadn't been a quick favour or a casual inquiry. This had been a mission. You knew I didn't go rogue, Nolan said. It wasn't a question. I knew it the day I woke up in that field hospital, Briggs replied. Had your blood on my boots and your voice in my head, telling me to stay conscious until the medics got there. For the first time in 7 years, Rhys Nolan felt something crack open inside his chest. Not breaking, healing, like a bone that had been set wrong, finally getting the chance to mend properly. That's when they heard the footsteps in the corridor outside. Multiple sets. Moving fast, getting closer. The cavalry had finally arrived. The sound of footsteps down the corridor wasn't casual. These were the heavy, purposeful strides of people who'd been pulled away from important things to deal with what was rapidly becoming a very complicated situation. Warden Bexley led the charge, flanked by 2 administrators and a man in a dark suit who definitely wasn't prison staff. Clean haircut, government-issue lanyard, the kind of bearing that screamed Ministry of Defence. He didn't introduce himself, but then again, people like him rarely did. What in God's name is going on down here? Bexley demanded as they rounded the corner. He stopped short when he saw them. Briggs, standing at attention outside the cell, still as a monument, Nolan visible through the open doorway, holding what was obviously official paperwork in hands that were no longer shaking. The scene didn't compute. This wasn't how prison visits worked. This wasn't how anything worked. "You've got exactly 5 seconds to explain what the hell you think you're doing," Bexley continued, his voice echoing off the concrete walls with all the authority of a man who was used to being the final word on everything that happened in his domain. Briggs turned his head calmly, meeting the warden's glare with the kind of steady gaze that suggested he'd faced down much worse than bureaucratic indignation. "I'm here under Directive 17A, he said evenly. "Repatriation protocol for service personnel held without formal charge." The hallway went quiet. Not the everyday quiet of a prison block, but the kind of silence that happens when someone drops information that changes everything. The man in the suit stepped forward, his face showing the first crack in what had probably been a perfectly composed morning. "That protocol doesn't exist anymore," he said carefully. "It was deactivated years ago." "Declassified," Briggs corrected. "Still valid. Still applicable under specific circumstances." He reached into his jacket, slowly, deliberately, and produced another envelope. This one was newer, the edges sharp, the seal fresh. He handed it to the suit. "MOD authorization. Reese Nolan, service number 24601 Delta. Exoneration under clause 8.7 regarding unlawful detention by commanding officers operating outside legal parameters." The suit opened it, read it, and his face went through several interesting changes. Surprise, recognition, something that might have been fear. The suit opened it, read it, and his face went through several interesting changes. Surprise, recognition, something that might have been fear. He was reading about more than just Martin Stroud's downfall. The document detailed a pattern of systematic abuse stretching back nearly a decade. Soldiers who'd questioned orders, reported civilian casualties, or refused to sign false statements, or mysteriously reassigned to psychological evaluation or extended administrative hold. 7 men like Nolan had simply vanished from official records. 2 had been quietly released after family members hired private investigators. 1 had died in custody under circumstances that raised questions nobody wanted to answer. 3 others were still missing, their files locked behind classifications that would take years to challenge through proper channels. But here was the real problem. If Nolan walked out of here today, those files would become evidence. And evidence had a way of finding journalists, parliamentary committees, families who'd been told their sons had disappeared for the good of national security. "Martin Stroud," he said quietly, but his voice carried the weight of someone calculating how many careers this could destroy. "Former Colonel Martin Stroud," Briggs confirmed, "discharged for cause. Multiple violations, including the unauthorized detention of at least 7 service personnel who refused to falsify after-action reports." The warden looked between them, clearly trying to catch up to a conversation that had left him behind. "I don't care what papers you're waving around," he said, but there was less certainty in his voice now. "You can't just walk into a military detention facility and expect us to hand over a prisoner based on some dusty regulation." That's when Briggs did something that made everyone in that corridor take a step back. He removed his gloves. On his right forearm, faded but unmistakable, was a tattoo that made the man in the suit go completely pale. Geometric shapes intersecting in a pattern that most people wouldn't recognize, but those who knew what it meant. "Jesus Christ," one of the prison guards whispered. "Eventide." The word hung in the air like a death sentence. Eventide. The kind of unit that officially didn't exist, the kind of posting that came after your regular service ended, and someone higher up the food chain decided you were the sort of person who could be trusted with the really ugly necessities. Post-theatre operations, the clean-up crew for messes that governments couldn't afford to admit they'd made. "Last active unit," Briggs said simply. "Clearance reissued for personnel recovery operations. Authorization came through 5 days ago." The suit looked at the papers again, his hands not quite steady now. Whatever he was reading, it was telling him things he really didn't want to know. "If this gets out," he began. "It won't," Briggs cut him off, "unless he doesn't walk." The threat wasn't loud or dramatic. It was delivered in the same calm tone he'd used for everything else. But everyone in that corridor understood exactly what it meant. This wasn't a request anymore. This was a notification. The warden made one last attempt to salvage the situation. "If you take him out of here, it's your responsibility. No protection from us. No support if this goes wrong." Briggs looked at him with something that might have been pity. "My name was erased from official records years ago," he said. "I'm not doing this for credit." He turned toward the cell. "Nolan." "Reese." Nolan stepped out into the corridor for the first time in 7 years. He moved carefully, like a man who'd forgotten how much space he was allowed to take up in the world, but his eyes were clear and his back was straight. As they walked past the line of guards and officials, no one moved to stop them. The paperwork was too official, the authorization too real, and the man presenting it too dangerous to argue with. They reached the outer checkpoint, where a young clerk was staring at his computer screen like it might start making sense if he just looked at it hard enough. His supervisor, an older man who'd seen enough strange things in his career to know when not to ask questions, simply pressed the release button. The gate clicked open. No alarms, no sirens, no last-minute heroics. Just 2 men walking toward freedom. One because he'd earned it the hard way, the other because he'd never forgotten a debt. The morning air hit Reese Nolan's face like a physical thing. 7 years of recycled prison atmosphere. And suddenly he could smell London again. Exhaust fumes and rain, and that particular urban mixture of a million lives being lived in close proximity. He stopped just outside the gates, blinking against light that seemed impossibly bright even on a grey day like this. Cars moved past on the street beyond the fence. People walked by with coffee cups and phones, and the casual preoccupation of citizens who'd never spent 7 years, wondering if they'd ever see the sky again. "Christ," he whispered, and his voice cracked slightly on the word. Briggs stood beside him, still in that perfect ceremonial posture, but his eyes were watching Nolan with the kind of attention you give to someone who might need catching if they fall. "Take your time," he said quietly. Across the street, a small crowd had gathered. Not protesters or journalists, just ordinary people who'd noticed something unusual happening and had paused to watch. A royal guard, out of place and out of context, walking with a man in prison greys who was looking at the world like he'd never seen it before. Some had their phones out, recording, but they kept their distance. Whatever they were witnessing felt too important to intrude upon. Nolan took a deep breath, then another. His hands, which had been clenched into fists without him realizing it, slowly relaxed. "What happens now?" he asked. Briggs didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice carried the weight of someone who'd thought about this moment for a very long time. "Now you remember how to be free," he said, "and I go back to standing guard." They started walking, leaving Belmarsh behind them. Nolan's step was unsteady at first. 7 years of limited movement in confined spaces, but it grew stronger with each stride. Behind them, the prison walls rose grey and forbidding against the morning sky. But ahead, London stretched out in all its chaotic, beautiful, overwhelming entirety. A world that had moved on without Reese Nolan, but was apparently still willing to make room for him if he wanted to try again. As they reached the bus stop, Briggs pulled out his phone and made a single call. Brief, efficient, the kind of conversation that conveys information without wasting words. "It's done," he said when someone answered. "He's out." A pause, listening. "No, clean as it gets." Another pause. "Understood." The conversation that followed was longer than he'd expected. Questions about protocols, about documentation, about what happened next. Briggs answered them all, with the patience of someone who'd anticipated every bureaucratic concern. "Medical evaluation first," he said to the voice on the other end. "Then debrief with friendly counsel. Nothing official until he's ready." A longer pause. "I'm aware of the implications. That's why we're doing this quietly." When he finally hung up, Nolan was watching him with something like curiosity. "Was that your superior?" Nolan asked. "Someone who understands that good soldiers don't deserve to be buried alive for telling the truth," Briggs replied. "There are more of us than you might think. We've been watching this case for a while." The admission hung between them, that this hadn't been a solo mission, that there were others in the system who remembered what honour looked like and were willing to act on it. He looked at Nolan, who was still staring at the stream of normal life flowing around them, like he couldn't quite believe he was part of it again. "There's a place," Briggs said. "Transition housing for ex-service personnel. Nothing fancy, but it's clean and quiet, and the people running it understand what you've been through." Nolan nodded slowly. "And after that? After that, you figure out what comes next, at your own pace, with whatever help you need." A red double-decker bus pulled up to the stop, its familiar shape somehow more beautiful than Nolan remembered. The doors hissed open. People climbed aboard with the casual ease of a routine that had never been interrupted. Briggs gestured toward the entrance. "Your choice," he said, "but I'd recommend starting with something simple. Coffee, a newspaper, remembering what Tuesday feels like when you're allowed to live it." Rhys Nolan stood there for a moment longer, looking at this man who'd risked everything to keep a promise made 7 years ago in a place most people preferred not to think about. "Thank you," he said, and the words felt inadequate for everything that they were trying to carry. Briggs nodded once. Sharp, military. The kind of acknowledgement that said everything necessary without wasting time on sentiment. "Thank me by living well," he replied. Then he turned and walked away, his red tunic bright against the grey morning, his bearing as perfect as if he were on parade at Buckingham Palace instead of a South London street. Nolan watched him go, then climbed aboard the bus. As it pulled away from the curb, he caught one last glimpse of Lance Sergeant Callum Briggs in the side mirror, already disappearing into the crowd. But he'd done what he came to do. A debt had been paid. A wrong had been righted. And somewhere in the maze of official paperwork and bureaucratic machinery that kept the country running, a file was being quietly closed on a case that should never have existed in the first place. The bus carried Rhys Nolan into the heart of London, toward whatever came next. 7 years later than planned, but finally moving forward. Behind them, back at Belmarsh, phones were ringing. Emergency meetings were being called. Files that had been buried were suddenly being dusted off and reviewed by people with the authority to ask uncomfortable questions. Within hours, 2 more soldiers would be quietly released from similar administrative holds at facilities across the country. By the end of the week, a parliamentary committee would announce a review of detention procedures for military personnel. The names would never make headlines, that wasn't how these things worked, but justice had a way of spreading once it found a crack in the wall. Briggs had known this when he walked through those prison gates. He'd understood that freeing Nolan was just the beginning, not the end. Sometimes you had to break one lock to discover how many others were holding people captive. The system had counted on silence, on shame, on the assumption that good soldiers would disappear quietly rather than fight back. They'd miscalculated. Because sometimes justice doesn't come from courts or headlines or public outrage. Sometimes it comes from one person who refuses to forget. So what do you think? When someone saves your life, how far would you go to repay that debt? Should good soldiers ever disappear just because they refuse to lie for their superiors? And in a world where the truth is often the most dangerous thing you can carry, who decides what justice looks like? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one, and these conversations matter more than you might think. If this story moved something in you, if it reminded you why loyalty and honour still matter, hit that like button. It helps more than you know. Make sure to subscribe and ring that notification bell so you never miss our daily stories about the men and women who serve with quiet dignity. And if you know someone who believes that good people should never be forgotten, share this video with them. Our next story is already waiting on your screen. Click it now, and we'll see you tomorrow with another moment that proves real strength isn't about the noise you make, it's about the promises you keep.